Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on the Geneva Convention. We're going to look at its structure, its history, and particularly focus on how the United States and especially Israel, behind which is the United States, have behaved toward the various protocols of the Geneva Convention. This is a very timely topic because there is an incoming administration. President-elect Donald Trump has had a history of essentially not friendly toward multilateral organizations, including obviously the United Nations, and especially organizations that look into human rights violations and organizations that ask countries, they can't enforce, but they ask countries to abide by international law as signatory members, in the United States is a signatory member, as is Israel, by the way, of the Geneva Convention. I am going to basically start by offering three basic themes around which I will work on the Geneva Convention and why it has not been effective. At least the modern version of it since 1949, not that the previous ones were that enforceable, considering that Germany signed the Geneva Convention of 1927 or 1929, I believe. And of course, the Third Reich proceeded to violate everything in that convention. There are three things about the structure. There are three things about the Geneva Convention that make it subject to controversy and debate, and also violation and lack of enforcement. One is the very structure of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention was established by Europeans. Geneva, of course, refers to Geneva, Switzerland, by Europeans in the mid-19th century, pertaining to European wartime conditions. That's one thing. So the Geneva Convention was really a document intended to, and we'll look at the dates and all that, and this is some of them more specifically. It was designed to essentially provide a set of rules for the warring parties once they were at war on how to conduct themselves, especially toward prisoners of war and civilians as well as refugees. Later on, of course, there were protocols to this. There were more add-ons to the Geneva Convention from the mid-19th century all the way down to the 20th century. The very structure of the Geneva Convention from its founding was that the great powers, that it pertained to the great powers. They did not consider from the very beginning. Okay, this is in the 1860s, by the way. They did not consider the global south. Europeans were, Western European countries had colonies. They were colonialists. The convention never applied, at least until the post-war period when the third world came of age, did not apply to the African continent, did not apply to Asia, and there was mild application, if that, toward Latin America. So the global south structurally was excluded. There's the second thing about the Geneva Convention, and this has been, there have been very good scholarly articles on this by Europeans as well as non-Europeans. Besides its Eurocentrism from the very beginnings, this was another Eurocentric institution. It eventually became a transatlantic centered institution, considering after 49, the US was the superpower that had wielded a lot of influence in the United Nations, okay? The second element of this, the second critique by scholars, is that it was not designed to either prevent war or stop war, but rather, and this is a serious criticism, to humanize war, provide humanitarian relief, considering that it was inexorably linked to the Red Cross, by the way, the International Red Cross. Humane treatment toward prisoners of war, toward civilians, toward women, toward children, non-combatants in general, and respect for human rights, for refugees. Later, of course, there were other add-ons, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and so forth. This is much, much later. So the theme of humanizing war has been a theme that some scholars have developed, and they have criticized the Geneva Convention for staying there rather than, which is to say, prevent. How about prevent wars? How about a document to prevent war, or ceasefire, a document to stop the war? So it was war management for non-combatants and prisoners of war, essentially, and both on land and at sea, as we will see, with various protocols added. The third criticism, which of course has also been advanced, certainly not by the West, but many non-Westerners have advanced this criticism, this point, is that institutionally, the business sector and the media have gone along in supporting the Geneva Convention structure in humanizing war and using the Geneva Convention, as we will see, especially with the two countries we're going to be dealing with, the US and Israel today, using the Geneva Convention, manipulating, massaging it to serve their war aims, in leaving everything up to interpretation. Try to prove intention, that we intentionally bombed and killed all those children. Accident, it was a war, they're victims of war, war casualties, unintentional. So the Geneva Convention has been manipulated by governments. It has not been enforced, especially against Western powers. Not that it has been enforced against the Soviet, not that it was enforced against the Soviet Union or currently against Russia, by the way. Today, as we'll see, there has been a decision by a UN body, a UN court, the ICC, against Russia. No action. However, historically, this point is one that scholars have developed, namely that that governments have used the Geneva Convention to interpret it any way they like, and of course engage in all sorts of violations of the Geneva Convention and argue that it doesn't pertain to them in any case. And this is down to the present, right now, by the way, whether it's Russia and Ukraine or Israel in Palestine. So that's for the basically the three themes that I wanted to develop. Now, the second point I want to mention is that the United Nations celebrated the anniversary of the Geneva Convention, the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Convention in August 2024. In the very lengthy report, and I admit I only read parts of it, in its very lengthy report, there is a lot of criticism regarding the blatant disregard of international law by signatory members. Okay. By the way, in total, there are 196 countries that are signatory members. Not all have signed on to all the protocols, but the US and Israel, who have, as we'll see, which are the two countries we're going to focus on, because the US is engaged currently in a proxy war, if you will. It is behind, it's not hiding it, behind the war in Ukraine, and it is behind the war in Israel. That's a matter of record. It's not a secret. So there have been, according to the report of August 2024, there have been blatant and glaring violations of international law, disregarding the Geneva Convention protocols. Now, some of the signatories can argue and have argued that they're not, they haven't approved those protocols. They haven't approved all the articles of the Geneva Convention. And if we have time, I may even go through some of the articles, by the way, because this is a vast document and really this is a domain for international lawyers to just go through the minutiae, through the very detail. In any case, that was a very important criticism, and it came right after the ICC, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, had filed warrants for the arrest of the Defense Minister of Israel and the Prime Minister of Israel in May 2024. Okay? So the meeting at the UN regarding the Geneva Convention anniversary took place just a few months after the ICC prosecutor issued the warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel and the Defense Minister. What did the United States do to honor the Geneva Convention, which, of course, it is a signatory power? It invited both of those people, one of them, the Prime Minister, to speak to Congress. It invited both of those people to the United States. Okay? So even after Israel had been declared a country engaged in genocide, and two of its top officers, government officers, the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, were issued warrants, matter of record. The US demonstrated its defiance by inviting them to be guests of the US government. So obviously, this is indicative that there is no enforcement mechanism behind the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention relies on the goodwill of its members. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning this is because in March 2023, about a year before, a year and 2 months, 14 months before the ICC issued the warrants for Gallant and Netanyahu, the defense minister and prime minister, respectively, it had issued an arrest warrant for Putin and a number of top Kremlin officials. That one was a U.S. driven agenda. The U.S. was driving that agenda, whereas the one about Israel was driven by the global South, South Africa, if people remember. But a number of other countries also joined in. So South Africa, obviously, because of its past, and we'll talk more about South Africa and the Geneva Convention, its past with apartheid before Nelson Mandela. So what we have here is about a year and a couple of months before the ICC prosecutor issued a warrant for the two top Israeli officials. It issued a warrant for Putin and a number of top Russian officials. The U.S. demanded that all signatory countries arrest Putin if he go, or any of these other people if they showed up in their countries. Well, Putin went to Mongolia, and Mongolia ignored the Geneva Convention. It ignored the court order, I should say, not Geneva. It ignored the ICC, the International Court, the International Criminal Court warrant. It just ignored it. Now, the odd thing here is that the U.S. had no moral authority to say anything, or anyone had any moral authority in the West to say anything about Mongolia arresting Putin, because the U.S. had invited Netanyahu and Gallant, the two top officers in the government of Israel, to Washington. So Putin goes to Mongolia. There's an outstanding warrant out for him. There were outstanding warrants out for the other two people from Israel. So you see, defiance by the great powers makes the Geneva Convention ineffective unless the signatory powers go along in enforcing the Geneva Convention protocols. Then the Geneva Convention is just a piece of paper. Now, I want to basically go through the history. It's a very brief history, by the way. I don't want to bore you with the whole history of the Geneva Convention. But in 1863, a group of people met in Geneva, Switzerland, and they discussed how they could humanize the war, any war, I shouldn't say the war, any war in Europe, obviously, the European theater. In 1864, they reached an agreement. There were a lot of scientists, doctors, and so forth, and the idea was to make sure that non-combatants, namely civilians, women and children included, and POWs, were humanely treated. The core value of the first Geneva Convention, and it remains a value in all the protocols and all the add-ons down to through the 20th century, was respect for the human rights of citizens. Just because there's a war doesn't mean we blanket kill people and injure them and destroy without any regard for their rights. So human rights was one core value, and the other was humanitarian treatment, relief. By the way, In the first convention, there was a great deal of emphasis on providing medical relief to the wounded, making sure that the prisoners of war were treated humanely, not tortured, and so forth. So the first Geneva Convention had some limited goals. I believe there were 12. Sorry, there were 12 signatory countries. Very few, obviously, in the first one. In 1906, there was the second convention. And again, the Red Cross was an integral part of that. The second convention strengthened, expanded. There were more countries involved this time. It expanded the rights of civilians, stressed the importance of protecting them from harm, protecting them, their property from harm. So that, in other words, what they tried to do is argue that in the battlefield, the government should be giving orders to the front lines that their targets must remain military targets, not civilian targets. Okay? That was a violation of the Geneva Convention. So that was taken up in the second convention. There were more add-ons in 1929. That's when Germany, by the way, signed on. It was still the Weimar Republic, as it was called. Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich had not taken place. They had not taken power. They didn't take power until January 33, same time as FDR in the U.S., by the way. They signed on, but they never observed. They never observed the Geneva Convention. This one was more pertinent to Germany, which signed on to it, by the way, because it was about prisoners of war, and we know about how Germany dealt with, had a general policy, dealt with prisoners of war. One German killed 50 on the other side, including civilians, by the way, total disregard of the Geneva Convention. And not to mention, by the way, the Holocaust, the ultimate crime against humanity by the Third Reich. So clearly, here's another case and point where the Geneva Convention was completely ignored. In 1949, we get the most comprehensive document, and this is the document that a lot of people, I've certainly referred to it many times in sessions that I have held, when I talk about whether it's Ukraine or Israel these days. I talk about the 49 Convention. Although the 49 Convention had a lot of protocols that were add-ons, certainly from throughout the 60s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, by the way. So there were all kinds of add-ons. Now the 49 Convention was expanded, and the 49 Convention, I must mention, by the way, I must stress, took place against the background of the embryonic Soviet-American confrontation. The Truman Doctrine had been promulgated. The United States had bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Civilian targets, by the way. Atomic bomb, not military targets, civilian. There were military officers, there were military men in those areas. There was military presence, but the Geneva Convention makes it clear that you can't blanket bomb civilians just to hit a few military targets. It talks about that's very clear, by the way. In any case, we'll let that aside. The 49 Geneva Convention focused on freedom from sexual abuse, from torture, discrimination, the insistence on the Red Cross being able to deliver packages, inspect conditions, and so forth and so on. So it was a very extensive document, and there were all sorts of protocols to protect civilians. Now, 49 was still a year when decolonization was unfolding. So we have the background of the embryonic East-West confrontation, Soviet-American confrontation. 49 being the year that China succeeds with its revolution under Mao Zedong, defeating Chiang Kai-shek, who retreated to Taiwan. And 49 was also the year that the Soviet Union detonated tested the first atomic bomb. So the nuclear arms race begins. 49 is when the nuclear arms race begins, because another country other than the US has the bomb, and it happens to be a rival of the US. So the Geneva Convention remained a document that the great powers, in this case, especially the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, between them, the US, far more powerful, could easily ignore this Geneva Convention. And it did not. Still, in 49, there were still the process of decolonization. By the way, India just newly decolonized this. There was still the process of decolonization in the global South. Okay, so the global South was still, although there were, the language, when you read, by the way, the Geneva Convention protocols, the articles, and I'll go through some of those articles. When you read some of those articles, you'll see that the language is universal. It sounds like it applies to everybody, but in reality, it did not apply to everybody. Let me go through some of those articles, by the way. I'll just randomly go through some of them, because they do have applicability to what is happening today. Article 33, by the way, the Geneva Convention of 1949, this is very important to mention, especially those of you who have studied the Geneva Convention know that the framers had in mind what had taken place during World War II and what the Axis powers had done, and especially Nazi Germany, by the way, and they were right. They were absolutely correct. But obviously, 49, we have, you would think they would move on to universalize human rights in practice, not just in rhetoric. Article 33, for example, talks about individual responsibility for violating human rights, not providing humanitarian aid, avoiding collective penalties, being a crime and a violation of the Geneva Convention, pillaging the same thing, reprisals the same thing. Okay? So that's Article 33. Article 49, deportations, transfers, and evacuations. Exactly what's happening, by the way. What has been happening over a year now in Israel with regard to Gaza. Deportations, transfers, evacuations, a violation of the Geneva Convention. Article 49. Okay. Article 57 is that civilians must be spared from military operations. You cannot involve civilians, nor can you use civilians as a pretext, nor can you argue that civilians are collateral damage and use the pretext of some military personnel having a presence in an area where there are civilians and then blanket bomb or kill everybody. Okay, that's also in the Geneva Convention. Article 70, relief supplies. This also applies to Israel. We know the controversy with the State Department, well, some of you should know the controversy with the State Department and the relief supplies, some of the misinformation coming out, unfortunately, from Tel Aviv and Washington regarding relief supplies. The fact is they have not allowed relief supply. I mean, we live in an age of high tech. It's instant news. Everything that's happening on the ground, the world knows about it. There's no escape from reality here. So Article 70 discusses that. Not allowing relief supplies in for humanitarian purposes, a violation of the Geneva Convention. Article 76, protecting women from abuse and harm. Okay. We know for a fact that a very large percentage of the victims in the war in Israel are women and children. Okay, violation of the Geneva Convention. Article 92, medical inspections. Many who follow what has been happening in the war in Israel know that the threat of various diseases and the lack of medical supplies going in, has been a problem. So these are some of the articles. I want to turn now to that have been violated, by the way. It's not just Israel today. I'm bringing it up because it's happening right now. It has been happening the last year. But historically, these violations are not unique to Israel. They have happened elsewhere. And I will look at 3 other areas. I'm going to start with South Africa. The fact is that South Africa, before Nelson Mandela, and since in the 40s actually, but before that as well, was an apartheid state. There was no doubt about that. The General Assembly in 1966, the UN General Assembly, and then the UN Security Council in 1984, declared apartheid. This is pertinent to Israel today, by the way. But back then, 66 and 84, the UN General Assembly and Security Council, respectively, declared apartheid a crime against humanity. Okay? That is a crime against humanity. This is one reason that South Africa led the legal battle to declare what is happening in Israel genocide. The fact is that the protocols pertaining to apartheid South Africa were not observed by Israel, not surprisingly, at the time, or the United States and a number of other Western countries, by the way. Not surprising. Now, the Geneva Convention, I want to make sure people understand this, especially those of you who have some background in diplomatic history and diplomacy and foreign affairs, political science people. The fact is that each government has used the Geneva Conventions to serve its political goals, national political goals. And this is no different. So, for example, it was in the interests of many non-aligned countries to be in favor of the ANC, the African National Congress. At the time, that included, by the way, the Soviet Union. And it was in the interest of the West to be against the ANC, the African National Congress, and in favor of the white minority rule, which the UN had declared an apartheid regime. Okay? So what we have here is a situation where the Geneva Convention has been subject to politicization. They politicize, and it's politicized to this day. And therein rests the obfuscation, the confusion about and basically clouding the issue, trying to confuse the issue and manipulate public opinion. You see, there's a way to interpret this, and there's another way to do. Well, bottom line is the Geneva Convention is very clear. You can't kill women and children. You can't kill civilians. You cannot use a hospital as a target, even if there are, Geneva Convention, by the way, or schools or refugee camps, violations of the Geneva Convention. Those are protected by the Geneva Conventions. Those are violations of the Geneva Convention. And you can't say, well, we think there's some people hiding in the basement of that school or that hospital, so we're going to bomb it and kill everyone in it. Violation of the Geneva Convention. That's a violation of the Geneva Convention. South Africa presents an interesting case, by the way, because it set a precedent, because the apartheid regime ended once Nelson Mandela, there was international pressure, by the way, the corporate sector was pressured to abandon the, unless to put pressure on the South African minority regime. And to let Nelson Mandela was freed. In fact, he did. Finally, there were political rights, not economic and social rights, but political rights were granted. I want to make sure people understand that the Geneva Convention helped in that regard, but it did not do much beyond that. But at least the apartheid regime ended there. The other area where the Geneva Convention was completely ignored was Vietnam, by the way. And here's where the U.S. comes in. From Vietnam to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, to the U.S. indirect support in toppling the government of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, U.S. indirect support against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which is ongoing, by the way, because the Houthi rebels are pro-Iranian and against the Israeli war against the war against that Israel has declared against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, as well as Lebanon. Now it's expanded. The U.S. was also involved indirectly in trying to realize regime change, along with the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, obviously playing a big role after the Arab Spring rebellions, using that as a pretext to topple the government of Syria, the government of Assad. So the U.S. was involved from Vietnam to the present in Israel, was involved in a number of areas where the Geneva Convention was violated. Vietnam is the most glaring example, because it wasn't just Vietnam, it was Southeast Asia. Laos, Cambodia included, by the way. Okay, there is a ton of stuff. If those of you who are in graduate school and want to do projects on the Geneva Convention and how it pertained and how it was violated in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, you can go to the archives in Spring Park, Spring Park, is that it? In right where the University of Maryland is in Washington, just outside of Washington, where the U.S. National Archives are, and you'll find a lot of material there. There were violations of the glaring, blatant violations, by the way. The civilian deaths right and left, violation, treatment of prisons, everything you can possibly imagine was carried out. Chemical weapons, by the way, chemical weapons, napalm, and so forth. Anyway, so the U.S. has not, the leader of the free world, has not observed the Geneva Convention, and it isn't observing it now, inviting Netanyahu and Gallant to Washington, instead of at least having the respect for international law and saying, okay, we're going to hold, as Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out, what are we doing? What are we doing inviting these people? Um, you know, about some respect for international law. The problem here is very simple. You lose moral authority and the moral high ground when you do that, and then you don't have a voice to criticize Mongolia when they invite Putin and they don't arrest him. And you demand, okay, arrest him. He's a war criminal. Okay, we'll arrest him when you arrest Netanyahu. So the problem there is this issue of the double standard and using the Geneva Convention and human rights in a cherry picking approach. If we are in favor of this regime, then we'll protect it against the Geneva Convention, which asks that it not violate international law. If we're against that regime, we'll use the Geneva Convention to punish that regime. That's the problem the world has with the Geneva Convention being used by the great powers right now, especially the United States, because of what's happening in Israel. Okay? This is not, by the way, I want to make sure people understand. This is not to argue that China or Russia or Iran or any of the countries that the US regards as part of the X, or North Korea regards as the axis of evil, are not violators of human rights. Of course they are. They are. But let's talk about China. Let's talk about China. Specifically, the Northwest province, where there's a large concentration of Turkic background Muslims, Turkish background, they're from Turkish tribe. They're called Uyghurs. They're in Xinjiang province up in the Northwest. And the United States has been leading the charge for a number of years now against China for its own reasons, political. Not that China is free of is guiltless, by the way. Not that China is the angel here by any means. This is a minority that has had its rights violated, and that is recorded by the United States, but by the United Nations, by the way. In Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs, who are Muslims, by the way, they have many of them, especially people who have gone out of the country, have convinced the United States, and the United States took it upon itself to lead the charge against China on this issue, and declared China guilty of genocide in 2021. Declared the Chinese guilty of genocide. They took the case, by the way, to the International Court. The International Court would not hear the case. Okay, lack of evidence, procedural issues would not hear the case. The issue here is larger. The U.S. has been very vocal, and rightly so, in arguing that the Geneva Convention on Human Rights violations should be pointed out in Xinjiang province. Okay, and yet the U.S. dragged its feet on recognizing that the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar were persecuted by the military government and would not condemn. It dragged its feet for 5 years from 2017 until 2022. Okay. And then even worse, the Palestinian rights. You see the contradiction here? So there are good Muslims, the Uyghurs, and then there are not so good Muslims, right? The Rohingya. And then there are those Muslims we ignore completely, the Palestinians. Even the Israelis came out and said, condemn China, look what they're doing to the Uyghurs, which is incredible, because the Israelis have their own problem with a Muslim minority, the Palestinians. You see, this is the amazing thing about the hypocrisy without end here. No end to hypocrisy. So, again, all these examples illustrate how the Geneva Convention is meaningless, because the great powers hold all the cards. They do whatever they want. They cherry pick. And the reason that there are violations, human rights violations, whether it's in the Sudan today, and has been, by the way, in the last few years in South Sudan, whether it's in the Sudan or Ukraine, we're not going to leave Ukraine out of this. We're not going to let the Russians off the hook on this one. They did invade Ukraine. It could have been settled. Yes, it could have been settled diplomatically. Yes, NATO wants to expand eastward and make the Russian Federation less secure. All that is true. But that doesn't mean that the rest of it, that the war that has destroyed this country and has resulted in 1/3 of the population in refugee status, scattered around Europe, by the way, from Poland to Hungary, right, elsewhere, that doesn't excuse any of that. So universal human rights means just that, universally applied to all human beings without regard to gender, race, ethnicity, religion, any criterion. Universal human rights for all people. Okay, not cherry picking. I like that country, they're my allies, I'll support that country, and I won't support the other one. Now, the last thing I want to come to is, in fact, in the few minutes we have left, is in fact the U.S. role in various wars in the Middle East, including this one, directly or indirectly. The U.S. did violate the Geneva Convention, and in fact, even its closest ally, Israel, pointed that out when the U.S. pressed too hard during the Biden. He's still in office. During the Biden administration, when they were pressing too hard, what are you doing? You're violating the human rights of these people. And immediately, the Israelis were arrogant enough. The Israeli government was arrogant enough to argue, well, you violated all sorts of human rights, all sorts of protocols of the Geneva Convention in Vietnam. However, they did it in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Afghanistan, it's estimated 71,000 civilians killed during that 20-year war. This is a huge number. It's even worse when you consider that from 9/11 until the present, there is an estimated 5 million fatalities in various wars, from Afghanistan to Iraq to the Syrian civil war to Libya. Remember Libya, the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi? During the Obama team, by the way, was just as belligerent, just as bellicose as the Biden neocons, the neoconservatives. The Yemen civil war, for which the UK and the US were providing massively supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia, which was sending it to the regime, to the pro-Saudi regime against the Houthi rebels. All of this created massive dislocation of refugees. The Geneva Convention does cover refugees, by the way, and the deaths and injuries of civilians. Okay, so here's a case in point of civilians where the Geneva Convention could not. No, there was no who would enforce its terms. No one, because all the power rests with the principles, and once you get the great powers involved, they will determine what happens, and they ignore the Geneva Convention. The most glaring example, and I left it for last in the last few minutes we have, is Israel right now. It's because it's happening right now also, but it's a special case in my view. As a historian who, when I was, before I retired, I taught for a long time, I taught European history, and of course covered extensively anti-Semitism throughout history, from the Black Death to the Holocaust in Germany during the Third Reich. The fact is that there is no going around and no massaging and no amount of propaganda, no amount of public relations campaign that can possibly excuse the reality of the mass destruction in Palestinian lands, violation of the rights, confiscation of the land. That's another violation of the Geneva Convention, confiscating their land, by the way. The UN has spoken, it's very clear on this issue. And then expanding the war into Lebanon, causing more damage down there. And then trying to instigate constantly, to this day, right now, as I'm speaking, some kind of a conflict to get Iran into this. Now, of course, that Donald Trump has been elected, and there is a transition. It's both a time of optimism that all of this will end, beginning with the Ukrainian war, because he's obviously has stated that he's on the side of ending this war, with coming to an understanding with the Kremlin. And that will then have an impact in what happens with regard to U.S.-European relations, and that will have an impact in what happens with U.S.-Middle Eastern relations. And Trump, we know from his first term, is interested in ameliorating relations with especially the Saudis, but the conservative Arab countries. He wants the money. That is contracts for everything from weapons to expanding trade with them. Israel has, there's no way of getting around to the violations. I'm not going to mention all the reports, what the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, what the UN rapporteurs have said from various individuals. Albanese is the most famous one, that obviously she's an anathema to the Israelis and the US. But it is, all of it is documented. There are pictures and videotape. It is a violation to pillage. It is a violation to use civilians as human shields, by the way. That's a war crime. There is no end. And like I said, I'm not going to mention everything that all the violations of the Geneva Convention because they are killing journalists, targeting United Nations personnel. These are all violations of international law. Okay, who covers for Israel? The West and the U.S., especially the U.S. So they legitimize lawlessness. And that is what I want to leave you with. That's the conclusion I have. That violating the Geneva Convention is legitimizing lawlessness. And this is ironic, and that's why I'm mentioning this, because the country that argues that it supports the rule of law, the United States, rule of law, you don't want to go with the Chinese, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, they're the axis of evil. We're the rule of law. They're the most lawless in practice, by the way. Because here is a case in point. International courts have rendered their decisions. The UN has rendered its decision. All sorts of international human rights organizations have spoken out. Besides, look at the video. There's no into videos documenting what has happened since October 7th. This is not to argue that Hamas has not engaged in unconventional warfare, because I can see some people arguing, well, what about Hamas? Yes, but if I invite people to find out how Hamas was created, why Hamas was created, thanks to Israel, which wanted Hamas to be created in Gaza to counterbalance the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank so that there would not be a two-state solution. And Hamas, look at the history of Hamas, asking Netanyahu himself for a number of years for some kind of resolution. Give us autonomy at least. Let us have control of the utilities, trade, give us the medical supplies we need, and we'll want to engage in unconventional warfare. In other words, they wanted to go political, like the IRA turning in, evolving, and Sinn Féin in Ireland, those of you who know about Ireland, going into the mainstream, in other words, political mainstream. So the question here is, this is not to excuse, obviously terrorism is terror. Random acts of violence against civilians are to be condemned against human rights law, and against it's a violation of the human rights of an individual, and it's to be condemned, right? Universal human rights, it means universal human rights. Everybody's covered, no exceptions at all. But why exempt those who cause the most damage? Because they have the means to cause the most damage, namely the state of Israel, which is a military powerhouse, behind which is the US, which is the largest military powerhouse on the planet, by the way. So the Geneva Convention, in my view, has been manipulated by individual governments, namely the great powers and their proxies. The question is, where is all this headed? In the absence of the observance of international law, we have lawlessness. And if we have lawlessness, no country which violates international law has any moral authority. Because once you legitimize lawlessness, you can't come out and condemn the other side for being lawless when you just did the same thing. People are not stupid. They see right through that. They don't have to be college educated. They look at it. In any case, I am afraid that for some time in the near future, nothing will change. I'm afraid that the incoming administration is going to be more hostile to the Geneva Convention. I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping for realism. I'm hoping for a sort of a pragmatic approach by the United States during the Trump period, a pragmatic approach to hotspots from the Middle East to Russia. I'm afraid it's not going to be that easy for China because the Trump administration was, in its first term, very anti-Chinese, and it has announced, and we have to take its word for it, it will remain determined to pursue a policy of confrontation with China, making sure they think, by the way, in their delusional views, that China does not advance economically on a world scale. The genie is out of the bottle for that one. It's too late for that one. In any case, we hope for the best, but above all, an international order where there is one uniform set of laws and it is observed by all parties, and a multilateral approach through a multilateral approach with the management of a body like the United Nations. That's all we got. We got nothing else right now. That's hoping for the best. Obviously, there are scenarios that go down from there, but let's hope for the best. I thank you for tuning in. I ask you to write comments, questions, whatever you like, and I want to make a special plea with you to please subscribe to this channel with that is managed by Asad Alim. This is an educational channel. Thank you very much.